we read Module 2, which is called Anthropology, Science, and Storytelling. It's kind of funny in this book, in this textbook, I think it's funny, Lavenda and Schultz title all of their chapters in the form of questions. And they even, a lot of their subsections in their chapters are questions, like what is anthropology, right? And then next week we're going to read a chapter 2, and it's going to be a question. Why is evolution important for anthropologists? This is a question that you have never asked yourself, and you probably don't care about. So it's kind of funny that all of their titles have questions in them, many of which you probably have never even pondered before, and that's fine. It's kind of weird. And so they also have these modules. There are 4 modules. They're just these little sections about maybe science and methods. They tend to be probably more boring than the other parts of the textbook, if that's possible. This one may be actually our most interesting module, and some of you seem to think it was interesting. But so for this one instead, I've come up with a question that would probably get me in trouble if I ask it too loudly, especially around John Stone, right? Is evolution a myth? Question mark. I almost tried to make that the title of my webpage. I actually tried, but I was worried that all the trolls might come get me, you know? And he's been saying evolution is a myth, either the good trolls or the bad trolls. Actually, there's no good trolls. But anyway, so I'm going to go pose this as a question, is evolution a myth? Because we start out with this guy. Where is that guy? That guy! That's the first thing. Here we are talking about science and physics and evolution and the origins of the universe. And we start out with a Desana, a Tucano, depending on what you're going to call, person from the Amazon region, playing panpipes. What the heck is a guy playing panpipes doing in here? What is his deal? Why do we start with that? What's he going to tell us?
It was like this story about the sun and like all the different meanings behind that, and it was supposed to like represent like a different kind of myth than the other example he gave right after.
Okay, so it's a story that this guy playing panpipes, right? We're going to compare 2 different versions of how the universe came to be. One of them is actually more fun. You know, the Desana story is a lot more fun to read. There's the sun does some stuff, and it's cool. And then there's the physics story, which I couldn't understand at all, right? And so we compare these 2, and we find out that, you know, both of these are stories. They're stories about the world. One of them is told by a guy playing, well, I don't know if he was the actual teller, but let's just assume he's playing panpipes and then telling us a good story about the sun. And the other one was written by some physicist who was trying to bore us all in a textbook. So both of these are stories. And if we go on from there, and a lot of you got into this part of things, and I wanted you to, right? It's a good, interesting way to start out. That both of these stories are actually myths. Whoa. But only in the anthropological sense of the word myth. So Lavenda and Schultz here give us the definition of the anthropological use of myth, which is, quote, stories that recount how various aspects of the world came to be the way they are. That's on page 24 in that little box that says myth. Right? So both of these are stories about how the world and the things in it came to be the way they are. And in the anthropological use of the term myth, they're both myths. Now, to an anthropologist, in this sense, we are actually not trying to decide which one of these myths is ultimately true or false. We're simply recording that they are stories about the way the world is. It's something that we read or we think or we talk about, and it makes our life meaningful. It makes it make sense to us. It makes us make sense of the universe. But But before we start saying, oh, okay, evolution's a myth, Desana creation story is a myth, there's all kinds of myths about the world, we have to be careful here because then they introduce an idea, which is what makes a story, or a myth, if you want, a scientific story. And in that sense, they are not equally scientific stories about the world. We have to be careful here because if you're going to be a scientific story, it has to match up with our observations and evidence about the world. It has to correspond with what we can observe about the things we know in the world. And if it doesn't correspond to our observations and the evidence that we can gather, we have to reject those ideas. Ideas that don't fit those observations, we have to reject or get rid of them if we want to keep being scientists and have a scientific story. It doesn't mean you have to throw it away forever. You just have to, it can't be part of the scientific story. So, as Lavenda and Schultz write, if ideas about the way the world works can be shown not to fit our observations of the universe, then the scientist must reject those ideas regardless of the consequences and invent better ones. So you have to get rid of the ideas that don't fit, then we come up with a better idea that better fits your evidence. Now Emma asked a very good question in her post, which is, what are those, regardless of the consequences, right? What might be those consequences of rejecting an idea that doesn't fit? And I would say here that people get very attached to their ideas. So you might have a professional interest in pushing your idea. Maybe it's made you some fame. Maybe you've been able to publish something, and rejecting it might have some professional consequences. It might also have financial consequences. Something about, let's say your hypothesis is that some ingredient is going to cure a disease. And so you go out to try and test that hypothesis, and it doesn't work. Your hypothesis falls apart, and the funder takes away the funding from your lab, and those are the consequences. So there can be a lot of consequences. Most of them, when we're talking about scientific research, are probably mostly professional consequences. You don't want to keep holding on to, you can't keep holding and pushing bad ideas. If they're not fitting the world, you eventually have to discard them. But in certain cases, let's say if we're talking about things with a financial interest, there can be financial consequences as well. And there may also be social consequences in trying to discard certain ideas as not scientific. So, I want to pause here also to say that it's important to note that we are always trying to come up with good ideas and better ideas to describe the evidence we have. So some of you fell into a kind of despair. And you said, how will we ever know? You can't ever know. Nothing can be proven. Nothing can be known. Oh my gosh. Don't despair. Don't despair. There's good evidence out there, and there's some good ideas. So we may not have conclusive proof. We'll never be able to take a time machine and go back to the age of the dinosaurs. But we do have evidence of the ideas, and we have scientific debate, and we can say things about what we think happened in the past. And as we go along, we're going to try and make those ideas better and better fit the evidence. A lot of the evidence just isn't there. Not every creature, as we'll find out, wants to be a fossil. In fact, most creatures want to not be a fossil. That's why they're alive. Right? So a lot of evidence is going to be gone, but that doesn't mean there's nothing we can say about the past. We're just coming up with good ideas to fit the evidence that we have. So don't despair. Don't fall into a malaise that nothing can ever be said. It's important to know that we do have some good evidence for the stories that we have. Now, this is kind of a funny question. This was probably the first time that you learned and read this story about the sun and the creation. I mean, unless you're from that part of the Amazon, which probably not, maybe, if you want to say so. Why didn't you learn this story in school? Yes.
Probably more associated with Amazonian culture.
True. Yeah. And why, how to say, why would you care, right? Who cares? I mean, it would be fun to learn, but there's no reason to learn it. Why don't we need to learn it?
It's like not a true story.
It's a myth that makes sense in a certain place, but we don't need to learn it to learn about the origin of the universe, right? Now, let's just kind of subtly think about this for a second. I think what Lavenda and Schultz are trying to do here, in my opinion, is to introduce subtly something that some of us in school were told is a controversy. The idea of creationism, or that there's a controversy between creation and evolution. And some people are like, no, we should teach creation in school or teach the controversy. And we don't, I mean, obviously we should learn about people's customs and religions and myths and beliefs. That's great. And we're going to do that in this class. But we don't need to do that in the sense of having it be a scientific story. So I guess I would say, in actuality, there is not really a scientific debate. There is not a controversy between creation and evolution. One story fits the evidence of what we know about the world, and the other doesn't fit. And so it's a great story, like the Desana story, or like other wonderful creation stories and myths all over the world. They're great, but they're not scientific stories. They're not scientific myths. Now, there are a lot of debates within science. Science is always debating, and people get confused sometimes because people are debating each other based on the evidence. But there are some things that are basically settled, that are, they're not really up for debate, and this is kind of one of them. This is not a controversy anymore. This is not a scientific debate. And so if you were from the Amazon, if you were a Desana person, I'm not trying to change your myths. I'm not trying to tell you your beliefs suck, right? There's no gain to me from trying to say that your myths are terrible. They're great. It's the same here. What I want you to know is the scientific explanation that best fits our observations of the world, right? Because a lot of times we get these really weird caricatures of evolution, and then we say, well, that can't be true. I'll tell you one that I grew up with. It'll actually come up on it'll be an essay topic for one of your exams. When I was growing up, I was told, I saw monkeys in South America. If evolution is true, why aren't those monkeys turning into people? When I was a kid, that was a pretty powerful argument. I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. Can't be right then. So one of the things that you might think or keep in mind as we look at the study of evolution is, let's look at what's actually being asserted by evolution instead of some of these weird, caricatures, crazy ideas that people use to knock it down. So I'm not interested, like I said, I have no interest in upsetting people's beliefs. I am actually quite sensitive. I grew up in a very, creationist environment, and I'm not interested in upsetting that, but I am interested to know if you can understand why science has come to these conclusions, what is up for debate, and what is basically settled. So I say that because I guess I would say in recent years, I have been getting some essays, a few months in that say, well, I couldn't really read that chapter because of creation. And I'm not trying to upset anyone. I'm not trying to change beliefs. I mean, we can have these stories are still super interesting and they're super important to us and they tell us things about the meaning of life, and that's great. I just want you to be able to understand where we're coming from on the scientific part of things about how we are ideas that fit the world. So let's go into a little bit more how science works, the issues of how the scientific method, which you've probably learned in grade school or something, the hypothesis and all the come up with a hypothesis, and then you have to do something about it. And I want to actually start with what they call the aliens hypothesis. So let's say we have some fossils in a certain settlement, and we say, well, wow, maybe creatures from another planet came and with their advanced technology put these things here, or artifacts, or temples, or pyramids, or something. People have proposed ideas about alien technology in various parts of the world whenever they find something that doesn't seem to necessarily correspond to what they think is going on. All of a sudden, these aliens ideas come up. Now, think about the aliens hypothesis is actually, at first, when you say, well, this bone or this artifact or this pyramid or these heads were put here by aliens, that's something you can actually test. Or you can go in and say, all right, fine, let's look for some evidence. Let's find the evidence that, that aliens put these artifacts or fossils or whatever it is you're looking at here. Now, when we say that, I want to pause here and say, what science often does is we attempt to falsify a hypothesis. So sometimes we say, prove your hypothesis. It's almost impossible to prove a hypothesis. What you mostly do is try to falsify it in the sense of you try to disprove it. And if you can't disprove it, then you're like, this is looking good. This is looking like a good hypothesis. So science can be very frustrating because a lot of times the major publications in science are disproving ideas that we once had. And you're like, well, these guys can't prove anything. Well, that's the way science works. It works by you come up with a hypothesis, and then you try to falsify it or you try to find evidence against it. Now, in the case of the aliens, people have tried to find evidence of this. It's not like it wouldn't be super cool to find it, right? We would be, yeah, that would be awesome if we could find some evidence here. But most of the time, actually all the time, the hypothesis of aliens planting fossils or artifacts has not been supported by evidence. So if there is no evidence, we can basically say that the hypothesis is falsified, that it doesn't really work. Have we disproved it entirely? No, who knows? Maybe they're aliens somewhere else. But at least in all the instances we've found so far, we have not proved this hypothesis. We've always falsified it. Now, if the people pushing the aliens hypothesis turn around and say, well, the reason you can't find the evidence is these aliens are super clever. They backdated all their technology, and then they erased their fingerprints, and then they scooted out of town before we could observe them. And so the fact that you can't find anything is just evidence of how tricky and clever they are. Whoa. Now, what Lavenda and Schultz say is, if that's your hypothesis, that you can't find evidence because the evidence was erased or whatnot, then you don't have a scientific hypothesis anymore. So, like I said, you haven't definitively disproved that there are aliens or that aliens have visited the Earth. But if you keep going and you say the reason we can't find evidence is because they're too clever for us, then you've come up with a statement that, as Lavenda and Schultz say, holds no scientific interest. Now, one of you wanted to know if it holds any interest. Well, yeah, sure, it still is interesting. It'll sell books and sell websites and get a lot of clicks if you put it up there. It's a good clickbait title. It's still interesting, but it actually doesn't have any scientific interest anymore. Now, actually, Lexi asked an interesting question here, because this is an example of a hypothesis that doesn't have any evidence and is probably false. And she asks, are there hypotheses that there's no evidence for, but are probably true? And there are some. Later on, I will tell you about the hypothesis of a coastal migration route into the Americas. That people from Asia, one of the ways that they took to get into the Americas was by taking the coast, basically sailing down the coast. The problem with this hypothesis, though, is that the sea levels have risen and basically obliterated all the archaeological sites that might be there. So the people that support this, it's very difficult to find evidence for it. And so some people call it a safely non-falsifiable hypothesis. I think it's a good explanation for why we see artifact assemblages at various places in the Americas as early as 15,000 years ago. It seems to make sense that people were maybe coming down the coast. However, it's hard to support. So it seems like a true thing, but who knows? Will we find evidence for it later? Maybe. Maybe. And so it's one of those things that is, so there can be two kinds of hypotheses, ones that are probably true but don't have evidence. And in that case, it still is like, well, you know, we're not sure if we can call it a scientific hypothesis. And then there's others that are kind of crazy and don't have evidence. And in that sense, we know that you're just trying to get your web clicks in. You're in science fiction, you're not in science. Now, in some ways, I think, I don't know if you have heard this term, intelligent design. I think that in some ways, what Lavenda and Schultz here, in the same way that they were subtly responding to creationism, I think this is their subtle response to something that got popular for a while, but I haven't heard of it much lately. But back a few years ago, people would say, they wouldn't say they were creationists anymore. They say, oh, I believe in intelligent design. And it was a wonderful thing, because if you say you're a creationist, people look at you like you might be not so bright. But if you say, I believe in intelligent design, then you attach the word intelligent to yourself, and you're like, whoa, that sounds smart, intelligent design. The idea of intelligent design was, wow, look at how complicated the world is. Look at how many things that are difficult to explain. Look at how it all seems to fit together and play nice with each other. There must be a designer. So the idea is, because the world is complicated and we haven't been able to explain everything, there must be some sort of designer behind it. And they kind of left that open, who they wanted you to be, you know, would it be who, it didn't matter. And so it acted like it sort of had this flair of acting like it was a scientific hypothesis. The problem is that you can't, it's again a non-falsifiable hypothesis. It's simply looking at the world and saying, this thing we can't figure out, so there must have been some ultimate designer that we haven't discovered yet. But there's actually never been a hypothesis that has been a non-falsifiable hypothesis that results in people thinking, aha, yes, there must be a designer behind the human eye. You know, a designer behind the way that humans walk. which is causes a lot of back pain as well. Whoever the designer was for humans walking around, we need to get a hold of that person and get them to rethink the human design. After that, Lavenda and Schultz talk about the idea of a theory and a scientific theory. And again, this is responding to debates within our own society. And it's a debate that has arisen because of as somewhat of a contrast between the way we use the word theory in an everyday setting and the way scientists use the word theory. So the way we use the word theory in an everyday setting, you may know some of these people. They come into your room late at night, maybe a little bit imbibed, and they say, "I have a theory." And you say, "Go to bed. Don't want to hear your crazy theory." The way we use the word theory is often to indicate that we don't know what's going on, that we don't have much evidence, and so we have some sort of theory to explain it. These days, if somebody says they have theories, you look at them like they might be a little bit nutty. In fact, we often hear today about conspiracy theories, which has further taken this word off in a totally different direction, because conspiracy theories and people who call themselves conspiracy theorists are spouting things that are obviously wrong. But that's the way the word has evolved in the everyday use. It's very different from the way scientists use the word theory, the idea of a scientific theory. It's not only very different, it's almost become the opposite of the way it's used in popular life. What is a theory in science? Page 28, Lavenda and Schultz say, scientists speak of a scientific theory only when they are able to link up a series of testable hypotheses to a coherent manner, in a coherent manner, to explain a body of evidence. So basically, what they are saying is that the word scientific, when the scientists use the word theory, it's a big jump. It's a big compliment if you have a theory, because what happens if you have a theory? It means you're above the level of hypotheses. It links together a lot of testable hypotheses and puts them together with a large amount of evidence. So when scientists use the word theory, it's about something that explains big things about how the world works. Like I said, it's almost the opposite of the way we use the word theory. So you may have heard of some theories, such as the theory of gravity, such as atomic theory, right? These are things that are explaining whole systems in the world. They've been tested in various ways again and again. We don't completely understand how gravity works, but we have some pretty good evidence that it seems to be working most of the time. So the theory of gravity, atomic theory, these are big things that help us out to explain what's going on in the world. And the same with evolutionary theory. And so in the old days, I don't know if these are still, people thought they got a law passed in some states. They put a sticker on the textbook that said, evolution is a theory. And the idea was that people would see that in the everyday sense and say, it's just a theory. Crazy theory. Actually, yes, evolution is a theory, but in the scientific sense, which means, whoa, we got something pretty big here, something pretty good, something that's explaining a lot of the world. So be careful with that. At the same time, at the end of this chapter, Lavenda and Schultz go into what are called science studies and some of the anthropological and other work that has been done on science itself. Because I think it is important. So at the same time, I'm trying to tell you that science is trying to come up with better ideas that fit the evidence, and that you have to reject those ideas, and there's a process, and there's a scientific method, and this is all important. But we also have to understand that science is not insulated from society. It is not insulated from a society that is the way it is. So, science responds to financial incentives. Science can respond to social incentives. So it is part and parcel of, it is connected to politics, it is connected to economics, it is connected to the world. It is not just done in a vacuum. And so we have to understand that, because sometimes we make science out to be, a religion or drop down from God as well. And no, science is done by people. It's done in the world. And what science studies does is to actually kind of look at, well, how does science actually work? How do scientists do their work? Do they always do this pure scientific method stuff? And, every time the evidence doesn't fit, they're like, good, I'm throwing out that hypothesis and coming up with a new one, here I go. Well, sometimes we hope that's how it works, but sometimes people stick with hypotheses long after they should have thrown them out. They stick with them for, again, personal, professional, financial reasons, and they don't discard them, even though people are arguing against them. So science studies explores how science actually works. It's been linked to something called laboratory ethnography, which was made famous, I guess, by Bruno Latour, who's discussed here a bit. Not an anthropologist or allied to an anthropology program, in the sense of, you may have seen this word in the first chapter. Ethnography is usually what we used to describe as going out to other societies, doing field work, and writing about them and bringing that back, that account, kind of like the Desana creation story that might have been part of an ethnography. But here's an example of people who would sort of do the same type of observations in a laboratory. And so they might observe people in an industrialized society or in a lab society to try and figure out, well, how does science work? How does it make sense of the world? How do these stories exist? And so what science studies does for Lavenda and Schultz and for many anthropologists is to provide a more accurate view of what science and scientists are up to show how science is connected to society. And hopefully we can then also improve science, because it's important to understand, if we understand how people acquire biases, for example, or get stuck to certain ideas and won't give them up, it can help us to improve the process of science. And so they say it provides a more accurate, if less exalted, view. And by less exalted, I think they just mean sometimes we have this idea that these pure scientists are going into the lab with their methods and nothing can stop the scientific method, and the next thing you know, we will have the cure for everything. Science has had its ups and downs, and every time we invent something to, let's say, the race to antibiotics, for example, great, wonderful, we love antibiotics, they have been very extremely helpful, but every time we use them, we find ourselves in an evolutionary race with the bacteria, which are also trying to evolve and evade the treatment. So, it is part of society, and there are always trade-offs in any kind of advancement that you might have. You have to be aware of the issues at hand when you do that.